The rotors of the Black Hawk helicopter cut through the frigid mountain air as we approached our insertion point in Afghanistan's Nuristan province. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting long shadows across the jagged peaks below. I checked my watch in the dim red glow of the cabin, 11:47 p.m. In less than 15 minutes, my team would begin a mission that would forever change our lives, though none of us knew it yet. 3 minutes to touchdown, the pilot's voice crackled through our headsets. I looked at my men, 5 of the best special forces operators I'd ever served with. They performed their final equipment checks with practiced precision, faces half hidden in shadow. Corporal Michael Hayes, our communications specialist, adjusted his radio setup one last time. The youngest of our group at 26, Hayes had an almost supernatural ability to maintain contact in conditions that would render most equipment useless. Next to him sat Staff Sergeant Derek Wilson, our demolitions expert. The silver streaks in his dark hair betrayed his age, but after 4 tours, there wasn't an explosive device he couldn't handle. Specialist Eric Rodriguez, our medic, methodically rechecked his extensive medical kit. His steady hands had saved countless lives over the years, both military and civilian. Private First Class Jason Cooper, our marksman, cradled his customized M24 rifle like a lover. I'd seen him make shots that seemed to defy physics. Finally, Sergeant Robert Sullivan, our navigation specialist, studied his topographical maps one last time. In terrain like this, his skills would mean the difference between success and disaster. The helicopter descended into a narrow valley, the downwash kicking up swirls of dust and dead vegetation. As soon as the skids touched down, we moved out with practiced efficiency, spreading into a defensive perimeter. The Black Hawk lifted off immediately, leaving us alone in the vast darkness of the Hindu Kush mountains. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks. Something about that wind made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It seemed to carry notes just below the threshold of human hearing, like a conversation happening one room over. "Area secure," Sergeant Thomas Cooper reported, his scope scanning the ridgelines above us. I nodded, though my unease remained. Our mission was straightforward on paper: locate and eliminate Abdul Nazir, a warlord whose forces had been terrorizing local villages with increasing brutality. Intelligence suggested he was operating from a network of caves in these mountains, but something about this mission felt different from the start. We moved out in formation, making our way toward an abandoned shepherd's hut that would serve as our observation post. The terrain was treacherous, loose scree gave way under our boots, and the thin air at this altitude made every step an effort. The moonlight cast strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, playing tricks with our night vision. The hut stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, its stone walls partially collapsed. As we approached, Rodriguez held up his fist, the signal to stop. "Movement," he whispered into his radio. 2 o'clock, about 50 meters. We froze, weapons trained on the indicated direction. Through my night vision goggles, I saw something dart between the rocks, too fast to identify, too deliberate to be an animal. But when Cooper swept the area with his thermal scope, he found nothing. "Clear," he reported, though his voice held a note of uncertainty I had never heard before. The shepherd's hut proved to be more intact than it appeared from a distance. We cleared it quickly and set up our basic operating center. Hayes established our communications array while Sullivan spread his maps across a rickety wooden table, marking key terrain features and suspected enemy positions. "Comms are up," Hayes reported, then frowned. "Sort of, getting some weird interference on all frequencies, like whispers or something." I moved to his position and listened through his headset. What I heard sent a chill down my spine. Beneath the usual static and atmospheric noise was something that sounded almost like chanting, rhythmic and ancient. "Probably interference from solar activity," Wilson suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "These mountains can do strange things to radio waves." As the night wore on, we established our watch rotation and settled in. The first sign that this mission would be different came during Hayes' watch, around 3 a.m. I was dozing lightly when his sharp intake of breath snapped me awake. "What is it?" I whispered, moving to his position at the window. Hayes pointed to a nearby ridge. I saw lights, not flashlights, more like fire, but green, and there were figures moving around them, but... He swallowed hard. "They didn't look human, Sarge. Their proportions were all wrong." I spent the next hour watching that ridge line with him, but whatever Hayes had seen didn't reappear. The next day, we began our reconnaissance in earnest, and that's when we found the first village. From a concealed position on a nearby slope, we observed what remained of a small settlement tucked into a protected valley. The destruction was absolute, but it wasn't the typical aftermath of a warlord's attack. There were no bullet holes, no shell casings, no signs of explosive damage. Instead, the buildings looked like they had been torn apart from the inside out. "Permission to check for survivors," Rodriguez requested. After ensuring the area was clear, I granted it. We moved through the village in teams of 2, documenting what we found. The bodies were wrong. They lay in precise geometric patterns, limbs arranged at impossible angles. Some appeared to have died in terror, their faces frozen in screams, while others wore expressions of ecstasy. "Sarge," Wilson called from one of the larger buildings. "You need to see this." Inside, the walls were covered in strange symbols carved into the stone. They looked ancient, but the cuts were fresh, the stone dust still settling. At the center of the room, a single survivor sat rocking back and forth, an elderly man with wild eyes and matted white hair. Rodriguez approached him slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. The old man's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on something behind us. He began to speak rapidly in a dialect none of us recognized, but one word came through clearly: Shaitan. Before we could question him further, he began to convulse. Rodriguez rushed to help, but it was too late. The old man's last words, spoken in perfect English, still haunt me. "They dwell beneath. The earth is pregnant with their hunger." That night, the whispers Hayes had heard on the radio grew louder. We all heard them now, voices speaking in languages that had died before the birth of Christ, carried on winds that blew from nowhere to nowhere. Cooper spotted more of the strange lights, dancing along the ridgelines like toxic fireflies. Sullivan discovered the first marker stone the next morning. It stood about waist high, carved with symbols similar to those we'd found in the village. But these were older, much older. Centuries of wind and rain had softened their edges, but they still seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of one's eye. "These mountains have been inhabited for thousands of years," Sullivan explained, tracing the carvings with his fingers. "But I've never seen anything like this. These symbols don't match any known ancient language or writing system." As he spoke, a sound echoed through the valley, part howl, part scream, but distinctly inhuman. We instinctively raised our weapons, forming a defensive circle. The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell that burned our nostrils, like rotting meat mixed with ozone. "Movement," Cooper called out, his rifle trained on a cluster of rocks. Multiple contacts, bearing 270. But when we turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows that seemed to retain their shape a moment too long, and the endless whisper of that unnatural wind. We were being watched. We all felt it now, eyes following our every move, belonging to something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. Our mission to hunt down a warlord was quickly becoming something else entirely, something none of our training had prepared us for. That evening, Hayes made a discovery that would lead us down a path from which there was no return. While scanning frequencies, he picked up what sounded like a distress call. The voice spoke in Russian, Old Russian, he said, and through the static and interference we managed to translate parts of it. "They are in the caves, the deep places. What we found, God forgive us. They wear the faces of the dead." The transmission ended with a scream that caused Hayes to rip off his headphones. When he tried to locate the signal again, there was nothing but dead air and those ever-present whispers. We held a team meeting to discuss our next move. Our official mission parameters seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of what we were discovering. The warlord, Nazir, felt like a peripheral player in something far older and more sinister. We need to investigate those caves, Wilson argued. Whatever's happening here, that's where we'll find answers. Or it's exactly what they want us to do, Sullivan countered. Every instinct I have says we should call for extraction and get the hell out of these mountains. Before we could reach a decision, Cooper's voice cut through the darkness outside our shelter. Contact front. They're coming up the valley. We rushed to defensive positions, expecting to finally encounter Nazir's forces. What we saw instead would change our understanding of reality forever. Through our night vision goggles, we watched as a column of figures moved up the valley floor. They walked with an unnatural synchronization, their movements too fluid, too precise. As they drew closer, the wrongness of their appearance became apparent. Their proportions were slightly off, limbs too long, joints bending in impossible ways. Weapons free, Cooper whispered, his finger hovering over the trigger. Hold, I ordered, though every instinct screamed at me to open fire. Let's see what we're dealing with. The figures stopped about 100 meters from our position. In the ghostly green glow of our night vision, we could see they wore a mix of modern clothing and ancient robes, all covered in a layer of dust and grime. Their faces were obscured by deep hoods, but something about their posture suggested they were fully aware of our presence. The wind picked up, carrying with it that same otherworldly chanting we'd heard on Hayes's radio. The figures began to sway in time with the rhythm, and the temperature around us plummeted. Frost formed on our weapons, and our breath came out in thick clouds despite it being a summer night. Then one of the figures stepped forward and threw back its hood. Rodriguez let out a choked gasp beside me. The face belonged to a local villager we'd found dead that morning, but now it was animated by something that had clearly never been human. The eyes were solid black, and the skin rippled as if something was crawling beneath it. Weapons free, I shouted, but before anyone could pull a trigger, the figures disappeared. Not ran, not faded, simply winked out of existence between one heartbeat and the next. The temperature returned to normal, and the wind died down to a whisper. What the hell was that? Wilson demanded, his voice shaking. Those weren't insurgents, they weren't anything. Before I could respond, Hayes called out from his position. Sarge, you need to see this, now. Where the figures had stood, the ground was marked with perfectly circular patches of dead vegetation, arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. In the center of each circle lay a small object that gleamed dully in our flashlight beams, spent shell casings from Soviet-era weapons. These look like they've been here for decades, Sullivan observed, picking one up, but they're arranged too perfectly to be random. A sound echoed through the valley, not the inhuman howl from before, but something more familiar, gunfire. It was distant but sustained, coming from the direction of the cave system we'd identified as Nazir's possible hideout. Think our warlord friend just met the valley's other residents? Cooper asked, trying to inject some humor into his voice, but failing. Only one way to find out, I replied. Gear up, we're moving out. We paced our advance carefully, using every scrap of cover the terrain provided. The gunfire had stopped as suddenly as it began, replaced by an oppressive silence. As we drew closer to the cave entrance, we found signs of a battle, but not the kind any of us had seen before. Weapons lay scattered across the ground, many of them bent or twisted into impossible shapes. Blood stained the rocks, but it moved wrong, flowing uphill in thin rivulets toward the cave mouth. And the bodies, some belonged to Nazir's men, their expressions frozen in terror, while others wore Soviet uniforms that had rotted away to almost nothing, their desiccated corpses arranged in those same geometric patterns we'd seen in the village. I count 12 bodies, Rodriguez reported after examining the scene, but based on the weapons and gear scattered around, there should be at least twice that many. The others must have retreated into the caves, Wilson suggested, but we all heard the doubt in his voice. Look at this, Sullivan called from near the cave entrance. He was examining a rock face that had been cleared of vegetation. In the beam of his flashlight, we could see elaborate carvings covering the entire surface. They depicted human figures engaged in some kind of ritual, surrounding a central figure that was distinctly inhuman. These aren't like the other carvings we found, Sullivan continued, his academic interest temporarily overriding his fear. These are newer, maybe a few hundred years old, but they're referencing something much older. Look at these inscriptions. They're a mix of Arabic, Pashto, and something else. Something I've never seen before. Hayes approached the wall, running his fingers over the strange symbols. It's telling a story. Something about guardians. No, prisoners. They were keeping something prisoner. How do you know that? I asked, surprised. Hayes had no training in archaeology or ancient languages. I don't know. It's like the symbols are whispering to me, like they want to be read. He jerked his hand back suddenly, as if burned. In the harsh beam of our tactical lights, I could see his fingers were covered in a thin film of what looked like black oil. A deep rumble emanated from within the cave, and a blast of cold air carried with it the smell of age and decay. Our lights seemed to dim, the darkness becoming almost tangible. Form up, I ordered, pushing aside my growing sense of dread. Wilson, take point. Rodriguez, you're on 6. Everyone stay tight. I don't want anyone getting separated in there. The cave entrance was larger than it had appeared from a distance, its mouth a jagged tear in the mountainside. Our boots crunched on pulverized bone as we entered, not all of it human. The walls were smooth in places, as if melted by intense heat, but other sections were covered in more of those unsettling carvings. The main tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, branching occasionally into smaller passages. We marked our route with infrared chem light tabs, standard procedure for cave clearing, though nothing about this felt standard. The first real sign that we were dealing with something beyond our experience came about 200 meters in. The tunnel opened into a roughly circular chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness above us. At its center stood a stone pillar covered in more of those writhing symbols, but these ones glowed with a faint, sickly light of their own. It's warm, Cooper reported, holding his hand near but not touching the surface, and I think it's pulsing. He was right. The pillar seemed to have a subtle rhythm to it, like a giant heart beating deep within the stone. The symbols appeared to flow and shift in time with the pulses, forming patterns that vanished before they could be fully grasped. A scuffing sound echoed from one of the side tunnels. Boots on stone. We snapped into defensive positions, weapons trained on the sound source. A figure emerged from the darkness, hands raised. It was one of Nazir's men, but the sight of him made my blood run cold. His skin was gray and pulled too tight across his bones, and his eyes were completely white, rolled back in their sockets, but he was smiling, an expression of pure ecstasy on his face. They are awake, he said in perfect English, though his mouth didn't move quite right. The old ones are awake, and they remember what your kind did to them. They remember the chains, the seals, the prayers that bound them, and they are so very hungry. Before any of us could react, his body began to twist and distort, bones cracking as they rearranged themselves into something that only vaguely resembled a human form. The chamber filled with a high-pitched, keening sound that made our teeth vibrate and our vision blur. Fall back, I shouted, but the tunnel behind us had changed. Where there had been one passage, there were now 3, none of them marked with our chemical lights. The thing that had been a man took a step toward us, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Its flesh rippled and flowed like wax, revealing glimpses of something dark and ancient beneath. Cooper opened fire first, his rifle thundering in the enclosed space. The round struck true, punching through what should have been vital areas, but the creature didn't fall. Instead, it left, a sound like breaking glass and screaming children combined. Your weapons mean nothing here, it said in that same perfect English. This place belongs to them. It has always belonged to them, and now you belong to them too. The chamber's air grew thick and heavy, hard to breathe. Our lights began to flicker and die, plunging us into a darkness that seemed alive. And in that darkness, we heard movement, lots of movement, coming from all around us. The darkness pressed in around us like a living thing, thick and oppressive. Our remaining flashlights carved weak cones through the blackness, the beams seeming to terminate unnaturally short, as if the darkness was actively consuming the light. 9 o'clock, Wilson shouted, firing a burst from his M4. The muzzle flash illuminated a scene from a nightmare. The walls were moving, covered in what looked like black oil that flowed upward against gravity. Shapes emerged from the viscous surface, half-formed things that might once have been human. "Rodriguez, phosphorus flare," I ordered. He pulled one from his vest and ignited it, filling the chamber with harsh white light. What we saw in that moment of illumination nearly broke us. The chamber had transformed. The ceiling writhed with suspended bodies, some ancient, some new, all twisted and merged together in impossible ways. They reached toward us with two long limbs, their faces frozen in expressions of rapturous agony. The stone pillar at the center now pulsed with visible power, each beat sending waves of nauseating energy through the air. "Multiple contacts," Cooper called out, his rifle barking. "They're coming through the walls." He wasn't wrong. The flowing darkness had begun to coalesce into humanoid shapes, each one wearing the face of someone we knew. I saw my brother, dead 10 years in Iraq. Wilson was firing at what looked like his wife. Hayes was backing away from his father's face, emerging from the stone with black holes where the eyes should be. "They're not real," I shouted, trying to keep my team focused. "Focus on the exits. We need to." A scream cut me off. Rodriguez was on his knees, staring at his hands. In the dying light of the flare, we could see his skin rippling, dark patterns spreading beneath the surface like ink through water. "Get it out," he screamed. "Oh God, I can feel them crawling inside." Wilson moved to help him, but I held him back. Rodriguez's eyes had gone completely black, and his mouth was stretching into an impossible grin. He turned his head toward us at an angle that should have snapped his neck. "Your medic belongs to us now," Rodriguez said, but it wasn't his voice. It was ancient and multiple, like 1,000 voices speaking in perfect unison. "He has such interesting memories. So much death, so much pain. He couldn't save them all, could he?" Cooper raised his rifle, but I pushed it down. "That's still Rodriguez in there somewhere. We're not leaving him." Such loyalty, the thing wearing Rodriguez's face mocked. "But you abandoned others, didn't you, Sergeant Thomas? Left them to die when the mission required it. Their screams still echo in your dreams." The chamber filled with screaming, the voices of every soldier I'd ever lost, every civilian I couldn't save. The others were hearing their own personal chorus of the damned. I could see it in their faces. Hayes suddenly grabbed my arm. "The pillar, look at the symbols." Through the chaos and horror, I saw what he meant. The glowing patterns had aligned into a recognizable sequence, telling a story in images that burned themselves into my mind. Long ago, these mountains had been home to something ancient, something that existed before humanity crawled from the primordial ooze. Early humans discovered them and, in their ignorance, worshipped them as gods. But these entities weren't gods. They were parasites, feeding on human consciousness, growing stronger with each mind they consumed. As civilizations rose and fell, certain people discovered the truth. They found a way to bind the entities, using rituals and sacrifices to create a prison of flesh and stone. The cave system wasn't just a lair, it was a cage, designed to hold these things for eternity. But now they were free, and they were hungry. "The warlord," Sullivan gasped, understanding dawning on his face. He wasn't raiding villages. He was trying to maintain the seals. The sacrifices were necessary to keep these things contained. A deep laugh echoed through the chamber. The thing that had been Rodriguez stood up, its body elongating impossibly. "Very good, navigator, but you're too late. The seals are broken, and soon we will walk the earth again. Your kind has grown so deliciously complex since we were imprisoned. So many new fears to taste, so many new ways to break a mind." The walls began to pulse with sickly light, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. More shapes were emerging from the stone, each one wearing a face from our memories, each one twisted and wrong in subtle ways that violated the laws of reality. Cooper was the first to break. He emptied his magazine into the nearest creature, screaming incoherently. The rounds passed through it harmlessly, leaving holes that sealed themselves with that flowing darkness. "Your weapons are nothing here," the Rodriguez thing said. "They are toys, like everything your species has built. We are eternal. We are..." Its monologue was cut short by a deafening explosion. Wilson had removed his pack and pulled out a block of C4. "The support pillars," he shouted over the ringing in our ears. "If we can't kill them, maybe we can bury them." It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. The explosion had temporarily scattered the shadow creatures, giving us a moment to act. Wilson began placing charges while the rest of us provided cover fire. It wouldn't kill the entities, but the impacts seemed to slow them down. Hayes, try to raise command on the radio, I ordered. Tell them to bomb this entire mountain into dust if we don't make it out. Hayes pulled out his radio, but instead of static or whispers, a chorus of voices emerged from the speaker. Hundreds of voices, thousands, all screaming in languages that had died millennia ago. The thing wearing Rodriguez's face began to laugh again. You still don't understand. We are already inside you all. Every shot you've fired, every breath you've taken in this place. We are in your blood now, your minds. You'll carry us out of here, spread us across your world like a virus. And I knew it was telling the truth. I could feel something moving through my thoughts, sifting through my memories like fingers through sand. Beside me, Cooper had begun muttering to himself, carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. Charges set, Wilson called out. 30 seconds on the detonator. Fall back, I ordered, but the tunnels were shifting again, walls flowing like water, passages appearing and disappearing. The darkness was almost solid now, filled with reaching hands and familiar faces, all begging us to stay, to join them in their eternal dance of pain and ecstasy. We ran. God help us, we ran through that nightmare maze, pursued by horrors that defied description. Behind us, the first charges began to detonate, sending shockwaves through the mountain. Rock dust filled the air, mixing with that living darkness. And somewhere in that chaos, we lost Cooper. One moment he was behind me, firing controlled bursts at our pursuers. The next, just gone, his scream cut off mid-breath. We couldn't go back for him. The mountain was coming down around us, and the darkness was getting thicker, hungrier. The last thing I heard before the final charges detonated was Cooper's voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I can see everything now, Sarge. It's so beautiful. You should join us. You should. Then the world turned upside down in a storm of fire and pulverized rock. The mountain's interior collapsed around us in a cascade of rock and ancient horrors. The darkness fought against the destruction, trying to hold the tunnels open, but even its otherworldly power couldn't stop thousands of tons of falling rock. We ran through passages that twisted and changed with each step, guided only by Wilson's last glimpse of his compass before it melted in his hand. Hayes stumbled beside me, blood streaming from his nose and ears. The voices, he gasped. They're screaming, all of them, every person who ever died in these mountains, they're all screaming at once. Sullivan grabbed Hayes' arm, half dragging him forward. The navigator's face was a mask of focused determination, but I could see the tremors in his hands. Don't listen to them, focus on my voice, one foot in front of the other. The tunnel ahead of us split into 3 passages. Before we could choose a direction, a figure stepped out of the solid rock wall. Cooper, or something wearing his face. His skin was translucent now, dark shapes writhing beneath its surface. Why are you running? Cooper's voice asked, but his mouth didn't move. There's so much more to see, the things they could show us, the knowledge they could share. That's not Cooper, Wilson said, raising his rifle. Cooper's dead. The thing wearing Cooper's face smiled, the expression spreading too wide, splitting his face like an overripe fruit. Dead? No, death is a human concept. We are beyond death, beyond time, beyond... Wilson's grenade interrupted its monologue, the explosion filling the tunnel with smoke and shrapnel. When the dust cleared, the Cooper thing was gone, but the walls had begun to bleed that black, oil-like substance again. This way, Sullivan shouted, pointing to the rightmost tunnel. The airflow, it's stronger here, has to lead somewhere. We had no better options. The tunnel grew narrower as we ran, the walls pressing in until we had to move sideways to progress. The rock itself seemed alive, pulsing with an unhealthy light. Faces pushed out from the stone, some ancient, some modern, all trapped in expressions of eternal agony. Then Hayes stopped dead in his tracks. Oh God, he whispered. I can hear Rodriguez. He's singing. A low melodic humming filled the tunnel, a lullaby that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Hayes clutched his head, dropping to his knees. My sister used to sing this, he said, his voice cracking. Before she died, before I failed to save her, they're showing me how I could have saved her. If I just stay, if I just let them in. Sullivan moved to help Hayes, but I held him back. Hayes' skin had begun to ripple, dark patterns spreading across its surface like frost on a window. "Hayes, soldier, fight it," I commanded, trying to reach whatever was left of him. He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw our comms specialist fighting to break through. "Run," he gasped. I can hold them for a minute, maybe, just run." The tunnel began to collapse behind us as Hayes screamed, a sound that started human but quickly became something else entirely. We ran, the darkness pursuing us like a living thing, bringing with it the whispers of the dead and damned. Wilson took point, his last few grenades keeping the worst of the horrors at bay. Sullivan maintained our direction, though I could see the strain it was taking on him. Every time we passed a branching tunnel, faces would emerge from the walls, people from his past, begging him to join them, taunting him with his failures. "The air's getting fresher," Sullivan reported, his voice hoarse. "We must be..." He never finished the sentence. The floor beneath him simply ceased to exist, transformed into that living darkness. He fell, and as I reached for him, I saw his face change. In that last moment, he smiled with a mouthful of writhing shadows. "I understand now," he said, his voice overlaid with countless others. "The patterns, they're so beautiful." Then he was gone, leaving Wilson and me alone in the collapsing tunnel. We could see natural light ahead, a way out. But the darkness was closing in fast, and with it came every horror we'd ever known, every fear we'd ever faced. The thing that had been Rodriguez appeared again, stepping out of the shadows. Now it was barely humanoid, its form constantly shifting between different nightmarish configurations. "To left," it said in that chorus of ancient voices, "the demolitions expert, who has spent his life dealing in destruction, and you, Sergeant Thomas, the leader who leads his men to doom. You'll make fine additions to our collection." Wilson pulled his last block of C4 from his pack. "Sir," he said, not taking his eyes off the creature, "that light ahead, it's our only shot." I knew what he was planning. "Wilson, don't. Someone has to slow them down." He pressed the detonator into my hand. "Get out. Tell them what's here. Make them understand." Before I could stop him, Wilson charged the Rodriguez thing, tackling it back into the darkness. "Run," he screamed, his voice already changing, becoming something inhuman. I ran. Behind me, Wilson's voice rose in a sound that might have been laughter or screaming. The detonator grew hot in my hand, the button pulsing like a heartbeat. The exit was ahead, a jagged hole in the mountain's face, daylight pouring through. I could hear Wilson screaming my name, but it wasn't Wilson anymore. The voices of Hayes, Cooper, Rodriguez, and Sullivan joined in, a chorus of the damned begging me to stay. I hit the detonator. The explosion caught me just as I reached the exit, throwing me clear of the cave mouth. I rolled down a scree slope, rocks cutting into my flesh, before coming to rest on a narrow ledge. Above me, the cave entrance collapsed in a cloud of dust and pulverized rock. For a long moment, I lay there, watching the sun rise over the Hindu Kush mountains. The air was clean and fresh, free of that ancient corruption. I could almost believe it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw my reflection in a pool of snowmelt, and I knew the truth. My eyes, something moved behind them, something old and patient and hungry. The darkness had gotten inside me, just as it said it would. I could feel it spreading through my thoughts, showing me things no human was meant to see. I made my way down the mountain somehow, driven by the last remnants of my military training. When the rescue team found me 3 days later, I was babbling about shadows and ancient gods. They diagnosed me with PTSD, pumped me full of antipsychotics, and shipped me back to the States. But the drugs don't help. Nothing helps, because I know the truth. The cave-in didn't stop them. It just slowed them down. They're inside me, growing stronger each day. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see my own face smiling back with that too wide grin, and I know what's coming. They're patient, you see. They've waited thousands of years. They can wait a little longer, and when they're ready, when they've spread through my memories and dreams like cancer, they'll use me to find others, to infect others, to free their brethren from similar prisons around the world. Because that's the real horror. The cave system in Afghanistan wasn't unique. There are others, deep places, dark places, and what we found there, it's just the beginning. I can hear them now, whispering in the back of my mind. They're showing me such terrible, beautiful things, and soon I'll show them to you too. After all, you've read this far, and that's all they needed. Just a small crack in your consciousness, a tiny opening through which they can pour their ancient darkness. Can't you feel them? They're inside you now too, swimming through your thoughts like shadows in deep water. Look in the mirror, go ahead, look closely, and when you see something move behind your eyes, remember, we tried to warn you. We tried to keep them bound, but now they're free. And they are so very, very hungry.